Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. In my previous video, I mentioned all of the Stephen King books that I believe are good starting points. In this video, however, I'm going to be discussing all of the Stephen King books that I believe are the worst places to start. So with these beginning books, they're not necessarily horrible starting places, but they're not ideal. As I get further and further into the video, though, there will be some clear examples of Stephen King books that you should never start with, and it would make zero sense to start with them. And we'll get to those at the end of the video. But anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So these first handful of Stephen King books, they're not terrible starting points, but they're definitely not ideal. The first one I have to mention is Cujo. I personally love this book, but a lot of people jump into this book and it's not their favorite. Even though this is a classic Stephen King book and it has a classic Stephen King movie, and a lot of people get the general premise of this book, it can be a little bit jarring to read because the first half is very literary and it deals with, just the everyday lives of the people that are in here. The real horror aspects don't show up until about halfway through the book. And by the time, or before people even get to that point, they might even DNF it, or they just think that first half is kind of boring. So even though this is a classic Stephen King book, and I personally love it, it's definitely not an ideal starting point. You're much better starting out with either like The Shining, or Misery, or Pet Sematary. If you're looking for horror, don't necessarily start with this one. Another example of a decent Stephen King book that would not be an ideal starting point is something like the first book in the Bill Hodges trilogy, Mr. Mercedes. And while this isn't a bad book, it's just not very representative of what Stephen King is known for. Stephen King is mostly known for writing horror. He's known for writing compelling characters, and his plots are not really there, but his character work is definitely what keeps the book going. Whereas this book is basically the exact opposite. It's more of a mystery detective tale, and the characters aren't that great. They kind of take a back seat, and the plot is really what kind of drives this book forward. And so it's pretty much the exact opposite of what King's been writing for his whole career. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a good starting point. I would wait and put this book off until you're much further into his bibliography. Along those same lines as Mr. Mercedes, one of his Richard Bachman books is called The Running Man, and this has very little character work and it's very plot driven. It's actually a pretty good, underrated Richard Bachman book, in my opinion, but in no way, shape, or form is this a good starting point, even for Richard Bachman. This is not a good starting point for Richard Bachman books, and definitely not for Stephen King in general. And this might surprise some people because I'm a huge fan of this series and I talk about it a lot and I love talking about it with people. But I honestly don't think that The Gunslinger, the first book in the Dark Tower series, is a good place to start with Stephen King. This should really not be your first Stephen King book, in my opinion. This book and this series in general is just vastly different from anything that he's ever written. And the first time that I read this book, even when I had about 12 or 15 Stephen King books under my belt, this was a very jarring read. And I did like it, but I only gave it 3 stars. And if this would have been like the first Stephen King book I read, I don't know if I would have read more after that. Now, as a caveat for this pick, if you are a fantasy fan and you are dedicated to finishing the Dark Tower series and you want to start with this book, I urge you to not quit after the first book, because the first book, like I said, is not terrific. The second book in the series is where it gets going. And if you read the second book and you're not into it, then you should stop. But definitely don't stop on the first one. But like I said, it's not a great starting point for Stephen King because it's just written vastly different than all of his other works. You're much better off starting with one of the books that I mentioned in my previous video. And then once you get a few of those books down, you can try and start with this one. And this next book might shock constant readers, not because it's a good book, but because it's a bad book. And a lot of people do not like this book. I kind of like it, and I'm definitely in the minority there, but I will agree, it's not a great starting point. Do not start with this book. And that would, of course, be Sleeping Beauties. I love the first half of this book. The first half introduces all of the characters. It introduces the general premise, which is that all of the women in the world are mysteriously falling asleep, and they have this cocoon woven on their face. And if you try to wake them, they turn into, like, dangerous killers. And it's a really cool premise, and the character work in the first half of the book is great. Then the second half, it kind of tampers down, and the ending is meh, but I thought it was a pretty decent book. Most people don't like it, and I definitely see why. And even though I do enjoy it, it's not a great starting point for Stephen King. This should not be your first entry into Stephen King's work. And it's a pretty lengthy novel, too. If you want to jump into a lengthy Stephen King book, you're more than likely going to love It or The Stand more so than Sleeping Beauties. So in my previous video, I mentioned that Night Shift, Different Seasons, and Skeleton Crew are all terrific starting points if you want to read some of his short stories and novellas. These short story collections I'm actually not a huge fan of, and that would be The Bazaar of Bad Dreams and Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Even though there are a handful of great stories in each of these collections, overall they were just both very underwhelming, and I would not recommend starting with either of them. But of course, short story collections can be very subjective. There could be a bunch of stories in this collection that I thought were really boring, or that I thought just were really lackluster. Someone else could really love them though. Same thing with this one. So these aren't necessarily terrible starting points, but I would not recommend it. I would recommend starting with some of his earlier short story collections, like Night Shift and Different Seasons. I have a handful of Stephen King novels here that I'm not a huge fan of, and I definitely believe that these are some of the worst places to start with Stephen King. You have Cell, Desperation, The Tommyknockers, and Dreamcatcher. The story starts out with cell phones causing people to turn into zombies, essentially, which is a pretty cool premise for a story, and the first 100 pages or so of the story is pretty good. It kind of tampers down a bit, and then the ending is pretty bad, and overall, it's just not a great Stephen King novel. Definitely not one that anyone should start with. Desperation, while it's not at all a terrible book, it's just a book that I'm afraid that people would kind of lose interest in, because it is a bit of a chunky book. It gets kind of repetitive, and it's not one of his best, and it's definitely not a terrific place to start. The one thing that it has going for it is that it has a unique setting where it takes place in kind of a desert setting, and so that aspect is pretty cool and pretty unique to Stephen King. But the character work isn't that great, and then what goes on in the book, it can be a bit shocking, but if you don't really care about the characters, it doesn't really make that much of an impact. And Stephen King himself has said that these next two books that I'm going to talk about are some of the worst books that he's published, and that would include The Tommyknockers and Dreamcatcher. So just off of that opinion alone should tell you how bad these books are, and that they're definitely not a good starting point. The Tommyknockers is all about a woman finding a spacecraft underground when she goes for a walk, and it's about her kind of dealing with the side effects of that, and then eventually the whole town deals with the side effects of uncovering this ancient alien artifact. And it starts out pretty good. Like the first 100 pages or so is definitely good, but then with a lot of Stephen King's longer books, the middle section is just over bloated, And it's for sure not a great starting point with Stephen King. And the man himself would agree. Kind of the same thing with Dreamcatcher. I actually really love part 1 to Dreamcatcher, which is a little over 250 pages. It starts out pretty good with compelling characters and a pretty interesting premise. But then by the time you get to the middle, you're just like, all right, King, let's go. Come on. It's definitely a bit bloated. And then the ending, it's not anything spectacular. So it's a pretty lengthy book. And to get to an ending like that, a lot of people are very disappointed. So I would definitely agree that this is not a great starting point for Stephen King. You're much better off with one of his older books or some of the books that I mentioned in my previous video. And these next handful of books I'm completely biased about because they're some of my all-time least favorite Stephen King books. I would highly urge you to not start with these books, and I'll tell you why. First off, one of his newer books, if you can really call it that, is Elevation, which is basically just a glorified short story. I can't believe I paid full price for this. It's one of my least favorite Stephen King stories he's ever written. The characters aren't compelling, and there's no real conflict in the story. And why am I going to read a Stephen King book without any conflict? So please don't waste your time with this story, and especially don't make this your first Stephen King read. Good God. Do not start with this. By far one of my least favorite Richard Bachman books and one of my all-time least favorite Stephen King books is the first story in this collection of Bachman books called Rage, and I just flat out don't like it. I don't really like the premise. It's all about a kid who shoots his math teacher and holds the classroom hostage. I think it's very outdated. King has a great ability to have the reader suspend their disbelief to get them to believe the unbelievable. But with this story, there's no supernatural element, and I find it to be one of the most unbelievable, hard to believe stories that he's ever written. And it's never been one of my favorites. In fact, it's one of my least favorites, and I would highly urge anyone to not start with this book. And then, of course, there's my least favorite Stephen King book that I was able to finish. And this is the only Stephen King book that I've not given it at least 2 stars to. I gave it 1.5 stars. And it's bad, in my opinion. I know it has a lot of fans, but it's just easily my least favorite Stephen King book that I've been able to finish. And that would be The Talisman. Blech. So it's co-written by Peter Straub, and you can definitely tell that sections of this book are just not written by Stephen King. The language in here is very clunky, and it just doesn't read like a normal Stephen King book. But on top of that, the origin story for this book is that when Stephen King and Peter Straub agreed to co-write a book, a lot of horror fans were really excited because at the time, they were kind of the 2 big names in horror. And then when they came out with this book, everyone expected it to be like a very creepy book, but it turns out they wrote a 700-page fantasy novel. What the fuck? And it took me several attempts to finish this book, and it's no good. It's no good, people. And even if I read a bad Stephen King book, a King book that I'm actively disliking while I'm reading it, there's always something that I can value in it. There's like a scene, or there's a character that I can get involved in. With this book, it pretty much had nothing going for it. And again, I know it has a lot of fans, but I really hate it. And please, for the love of God, don't make this your first Stephen King read. Don't do it. He's got so many great books. Don't pick this one, please. Please. And then this next book just really wouldn't make any sense to start with because it's not even a fiction book. It would be Dance Macabre, and it's a nonfiction, like sort of dry academic reading of Stephen King essays where he talks about the horror genre And you would think that would be cool, right? Stephen King, the master of horror, talking about the history of horror. But it's extremely boring, and if you want a book to cure your insomnia, this book will do it for you, for sure. I guess if you are super interested in learning more about the history of horror and taking a deep dive into very academic writing from Stephen King, you know, that's fine. But most people, when they come to Stephen King, they want an interesting story, they want to get scared, they want to have compelling characters to root for or to root against. This book has none of that because it's nonfiction. So don't start with it. In these last 4 books, 2 of them are pretty bad books that I don't like. 2 of them are actually really good books that I love. But it would make 0 sense to start with them. 0. Why the fuck would anyone start with these books? If anyone starts their Stephen King reading career with any of these books, it would make 0 fucking sense. 0 sense. So we'll go ahead and start with the bad ones. We got Black House, which is the sequel to my least favorite Stephen King book that I've been able to finish, The Talisman. Just talked about it. Piece of shit book. I've never been able to finish this. I've tried 4 times, and it's not only is it a bad book that I've never been able to finish, it's a sequel to a book. So why the hell would you start with this book? Don't do it. Don't do it. Along those same lines, the first 2 books in the Bill Hodges trilogy, Mr. Mercedes and Finders Keepers, are pretty good books, especially Finders Keepers. But the 3rd book isn't that great. End of watch. And of course, why would you start with the 3rd book in a trilogy? Why the hell would you do that? Don't do that. And then, of course, there's one of my favorite Stephen King sequels of all time, and that would be Dr. Sleep, which is the sequel to The Shining. Fantastic book. I even like it slightly more than The Shining. But why the fuck would you read this book before you read The Shining? Why would you do it? Don't do it. Don't do it. And for my last pick for this video, the absolute #1 worst place to start with Stephen King. If you start with this book, oh my God. I can't even fathom a world where someone would start with this book. Why would anyone do that? Why? And that book would, of course, be The Dark Tower. Book 7, the final book in the Dark Tower series. Why the fuck would you start with this book? Why? Why? If you truly think that this is a good place to start with Stephen King, you have forgotten the face of your father, and you have to have your memory wiped clean. If you start with this book, you're a fucking psychopath. So of course I'm kidding. No one would really start with this book. It would make 0 sense. So, you know, this is just kind of a joke. But seriously, if I saw anyone like reading this book and I walked up to them, I was like, "Oh wow, you're reading the last Dark Tower book," and they're like, "Yeah, it's pretty good." And I'm like, "So what's your favorite, Stephen King book so far?" And they said, "Oh, this is my first one." What? So if you are looking for a good place to start with Stephen King, it's not this book. Trust me. Alright, so those are all of the Stephen King books that I deem the worst places to start with Stephen King. The worst places. And please let me know if you agree with my picks down in the comments below. Are these books bad places to start, or do you disagree with me? If so, what are your picks for the worst places to start with Stephen King? Also, do you have any horror stories of starting with Stephen King books and you just don't vibe with them and you retroactively think, oh, that probably wasn't a perfect place to start with Stephen King? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.